High above the forests of Bavaria, stone by stone, Neuschwanstein Castle began to rise not as a fortress, but as an idea. It was never meant to defend borders or command armies. For Ludwig II of Bavaria, the castle existed first in imagination, shaped by medieval legends, operatic drama, and a deep longing to escape the political reality of his time. Ludwig did not see himself as a modern ruler. He saw himself as a romantic king, born too late for the age he admired. The industrial world closing in around him felt crude and disenchanted. Railways cut through valleys. Factories replaced forests, and politics demanded compromise. Neuschwanstein was conceived as a refuge from all of this, a private stage where the ideals of chivalry, loyalty, and beauty could still exist untouched. The castle's design reflected this inner world. Towers rose dramatically from sheer cliffs, not because they were practical, but because they felt right. Every facade referenced medieval forms filtered through 19th century imagination rather than historical accuracy. It was a dream of the Middle Ages, not a reconstruction. Ludwig was not interested in how castles had been, only in how they should have been. Inside, the vision became even more personal. Rooms were dedicated to scenes from Germanic legends and the operas of Richard Wagner, whom Ludwig admired obsessively. Walls were covered with murals of heroic knights, tragic lovers, and divine quests. The throne room resembled a Byzantine basilica, designed to elevate kingship into something sacred and timeless, even though the throne itself was never installed. Construction ignored practicality. Modern technology, steel beams, central heating, running water, was hidden behind medieval imagery. Ludwig wanted comfort without modern appearance, fantasy without visible machinery. Costs spiraled as revisions multiplied. Plans changed constantly, driven by emotion rather than budget. The castle was never finished because the vision itself kept evolving. As Neuschwanstein grew, so did Ludwig's isolation. He withdrew from court life, ruling less and retreating further into his imagined world. The castle became both sanctuary and symbol, proof of creative will, but also evidence of detachment. Ministers grew alarmed as debts mounted and governance suffered. What Ludwig saw as devotion to beauty, others saw as dangerous obsession. By the time his reign collapsed, Neuschwanstein stood incomplete, yet unmistakable. It was neither home nor fortress, neither practical nor modest. It was the physical imprint of a mind refusing to adapt to modernity, choosing instead to build a world shaped entirely by longing, myth, and solitude. Long after Ludwig was gone, the castle remained, still perched above the valley, still unreal, still expressing a vision that had never belonged to the age it was built in. The concept did not emerge from military need or royal protocol, but from stories absorbed in solitude. Ludwig II of Bavaria imagined a place where legend could exist without explanation, where stone and paint could hold emotions that real life refused to accommodate. The castle took shape, first as an emotional landscape, not an architectural plan. Rather than copying medieval structures, the design borrowed their feeling. Walls rose dramatically, not to repel enemies, but to evoke awe. Towers were placed for visual rhythm rather than defense. Windows framed landscapes like paintings, turning nature into part of the composition. The building did not obey history. It obeyed mood. Every angle was meant to feel like a scene paused mid-story. The romantic imagination behind the castle rejected realism. Interiors depicted moments from myth, poetry, and opera, frozen at their most dramatic points. Knights appeared eternally loyal, lovers eternally devoted, destinies eternally unresolved. These images did not decorate the rooms. They defined them. Living inside the castle meant inhabiting a continuous narrative rather than a functional space. Light was treated as an emotional tool. High windows allowed sunlight to spill into halls at precise angles, illuminating murals and mosaics in ways that changed throughout the day. Shadow was equally important, creating quiet corners where time seemed suspended. The castle encouraged reflection, not activity. Movement slowed naturally within its spaces. Sound mattered as much as sight. Corridors amplified footsteps, halls carried echoes, and silence was preserved deliberately. The building felt designed for listening, to music, to thought, to imagined voices of another era. It was architecture meant to host inner experience rather than social life. Guests were rare. Ceremony was secondary to atmosphere. The surrounding landscape was not merely a backdrop. Forests, cliffs, and mountains were integrated into the fantasy. The castle did not dominate nature. It dramatized it. From certain viewpoints, it appeared to grow directly out of the rock, blurring the line between constructed dream and natural myth. Reality was reshaped rather than escaped. As the structure rose, it became clear that completion was never the true goal. The romantic imagination driving the project thrived on becoming, not finishing. Plans evolved continuously. Rooms were reimagined, details revised. The castle existed in a permanent state of aspiration, mirroring the inner world that created it. What emerged was not a residence suited for daily life, but a physical expression of longing. A castle born not from strategy or tradition, but from the desire to live inside a story that reality no longer offered. The structure rises dramatically above the Bavarian landscape, yet its commanding position was never intended to control territory. Neuschwanstein Castle overlooks valleys and passes, but it was not designed to monitor roads, store weapons, or house troops. Height, in this case, served spectacle, rather than strategy. The castle's placement was chosen for visual impact, not tactical advantage. Defensive architecture follows strict logic, and Neuschwanstein ignores it almost entirely. Its walls are thin compared to medieval fortresses, built to support decoration rather than withstand siege weapons. There are no true battlements designed for archers, no layered gate systems, no kill zones, no defensive courtyards. The towers that dominate its silhouette would have been liabilities in real combat, offering targets rather than protection. Access routes further reveal its non-military nature. The approach to the castle is ceremonial rather than defensive, guiding visitors through carefully framed views instead of forcing attackers into narrow, controlled paths. A real fortress restricts movement and visibility. Neuschwanstein invites it. The design assumes peaceful arrival, not hostile advance. Inside, the absence of military function becomes even clearer. There are no barracks, armories, or command spaces. Rooms are arranged for symbolism, storytelling, and solitude rather than coordination or defense. Circulation within the castle prioritizes experience over efficiency, with long corridors and isolated chambers that would be impractical in any defensive emergency. Even its construction period made military relevance impossible. Built in the late 19th century, the castle emerged in an age of artillery, railways, and modern armies. Stone walls and towers were obsolete against contemporary firepower. Ludwig II of Bavaria was fully aware of this reality. He was not attempting to revive medieval warfare, but medieval meaning. The decorative elements reinforce this intention. Painted scenes of legendary knights and idealized rulers celebrate moral loyalty and heroic destiny, not military readiness. These figures exist in a timeless, symbolic realm where battles are spiritual rather than physical. The castle's imagery speaks to ideals, not threats. Even practical choices undermine defensive purpose. Large windows, essential for light and atmosphere, weaken structural integrity. Interior comfort systems, hidden heating, modern plumbing, reflect concern for private experience rather than resilience. Every design decision favours immersion over survival. The castle, taken as a whole, operates like a stage set permanently fixed in stone. It presents the idea of a fortress without its function. Neuschwanstein was never meant to repel an enemy, because it was never built for a world where enemies mattered. It belonged to an inward vision, not an outward conflict, standing as a reminder that power can also be expressed through withdrawal, imagination, and refusal to engage with reality on its own terms. The creative force shaping the castle did not come from architects alone, but from stories that had already taken root in the mind of Ludwig II of Bavaria long before construction began. Medieval legends were not historical references for him. They were emotional anchors. Tales of pure knights, tragic rulers, and divine destiny offered a moral clarity he felt was absent from his own century. Among these influences, the operas of Richard Wagner held a dominant position. Wagner's works transformed medieval myth into overwhelming emotional experiences, blending music, legend, and symbolism into a single, total vision. Ludwig did not merely admire these operas. He lived inside them. Their themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and isolation mirrored his own inner life. Specific legends shaped specific spaces. Murals inspired by Lohengrin filled rooms with images of the Swan Knight, a figure defined by purity and tragic separation from the world. These scenes were not decorative illustrations, they were statements of identity. Ludwig saw himself reflected in heroes bound by fate, misunderstood by those around them, and ultimately alone. The castle's interior became a visual opera without sound. Walls functioned like stage backdrops, presenting moments frozen at their emotional peak. Rather than telling complete stories, the images focused on decisive scenes. Arrivals, vows, revelations. Time was suspended at the point of greatest meaning, allowing the viewer to remain inside the moment indefinitely. Colour and symbolism reinforced the mythic atmosphere. Gold suggested divine authority. Blue evoked distance and longing, and red marked sacrifice and devotion. These were not random artistic choices. They followed the emotional language Wagner used, in music translated into paint and stone. The castle became a silent symphony, its themes readable through space rather than sound. Ludwig's relationship with Wagner was intensely personal. He funded the composer, protected him politically, and treated his art as something sacred. In return, Wagner's world offered Ludwig a framework where kingship was noble, suffering was meaningful, and withdrawal from society could be justified as destiny rather than failure. The castle absorbed this worldview completely. Medieval legend, as interpreted through Wagner, allowed Ludwig to rewrite reality. Modern politics, bureaucracy, and compromise vanished inside a mythic order governed by honour and emotion. Neuschwanstein did not retell old stories. It relocated them into the present, transforming stone corridors into passages between legend and lived experience. Workers laboured at altitude for years, exposed to snow, fog, and unstable ground. Blasting was required to shape the rocky foundation, anchoring the structure directly into the cliff. This was not standard palace construction, it was engineering at the edge of what was practical. Accidents were common, delays constant. Progress depended as much on weather as on planning. The scale of labour expanded far beyond initial expectations. Hundreds of craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, painters, metalworkers, were brought into a region unprepared to house them. Temporary settlements appeared nearby, supplying food and shelter. The mountain became a working landscape, reshaped daily by human effort layered onto natural extremes. Materials rarely behaved as intended in alpine conditions. Stone cracked in frost. Timber warped with moisture. Designs had to be revised repeatedly to account for shifting temperatures and wind exposure. Builders adapted continuously, reinforcing structures not for defense, but for endurance against the environment itself. The Alps became the true adversary, far more demanding than any imagined enemy. Despite the romantic vision behind the project, construction relied on modern techniques, hidden from view. Steel frameworks were embedded within walls, elevators installed to move supplies vertically, and mechanical systems introduced to overcome terrain limitations. These solutions were never meant to be visible. The illusion required that the mountain-born structure appear timeless, not industrial. Supervision flowed downward from Ludwig II of Bavaria, whose instructions often arrived as emotional impulses rather than finalized plans. Rooms were altered mid-construction, towers were reshaped after foundations were laid. Builders learned to expect change, adapting their work to a vision that refused to stabilize. Efficiency mattered less than alignment with imagination. The mountain setting shaped the building's rhythm. Construction paused for winter, resumed in spring, slowed by rain and mist. Time stretched. What might have taken years elsewhere extended into decades. Completion was never clearly defined. Sections stood finished, while others remained skeletal. The Alps imposed patience, forcing the project to grow at their pace rather than the king's. Walls, towers, and halls were never designed to reflect how medieval castles actually functioned. Instead, the architecture followed an imagined past, one filtered through poetry, opera, and legend. Pointed towers rose not for watchfulness, but for silhouette, arranged to be seen from specific angles rather than to command terrain. Proportions favored drama over balance, creating a structure meant to be experienced emotionally rather than understood practically. Interiors followed the same logic. Rooms were staged like scenes, each space designed to evoke a story rather than serve daily life. Corridors widened or narrowed for theatrical effect. Ceilings soared where intimacy would have been more sensible. Light entered through carefully framed windows, not to maximize illumination, but to create mood, soft, directional, and symbolic. Medieval motifs were selected freely, without concern for historical consistency. Romanesque arches appeared beside Gothic tracery. Byzantine-inspired mosaics shared walls with Germanic legends. Time periods blended without apology, forming a visual language rooted in romanticism, not archaeology. Accuracy was irrelevant. Emotional resonance was everything. Murals dominated many chambers, transforming architecture into narrative surface. Walls did not simply enclose space, they told stories. Scenes from heroic legends, idealized kings, and mythical trials replaced any suggestion of real medieval hardship. The building functioned like a stone-bound manuscript. Each room a page meant to be read through imagery rather than use. Practical elements were deliberately hidden. Chimneys, heating systems, and structural reinforcements were concealed behind ornamentation so they would not break the illusion. Even modern technologies were disguised beneath decorative casings. Reality was allowed to exist only if it remained invisible, supporting the fantasy without acknowledging it. The overall composition rejected defensibility entirely. Windows were large and exposed. Courtyards offered no meaningful protection. Staircases prioritized elegance over efficiency. This was not a fortress adapted to survival, but a dreamscape fixed in stone. An architectural declaration that beauty and feeling mattered more than endurance or logic. The exterior rises as if assembled from a story rather than stone. Pale limestone walls catch shifting light, changing tone with the hour and the weather. Towers cluster in irregular rhythms, refusing symmetry, creating the impression that the structure grew organically, from imagination instead of engineering plans. From a distance, the silhouette appears delicate, almost unreal, suspended between sky and rock. Its placement above the valley is calculated for spectacle, rather than access. Perched on a rugged outcrop, Neuschwanstein Castle dominates the surrounding landscape without integrating into it. The drop below is sheer, emphasizing verticality and isolation. The building does not belong to the mountain in a practical sense. It confronts it, daring the natural world to frame its image. Approach routes were designed to heighten anticipation. As visitors climb through forested paths, the structure repeatedly vanishes behind trees and ridges, only to reappear from new angles. Each reveal feels staged, like a curtain lifting. The castle is not meant to be seen all at once. It is meant to be discovered in fragments, reinforcing its dreamlike quality. The surrounding terrain amplifies the illusion. Mist drifts through the valley in the early morning, dissolving edges and softening outlines. Snow transforms the towers into something weightless, erasing any hint of labour or difficulty. In summer, dense green forests contrast sharply with the bright facade, isolating the building visually, making it appear untouched by the world below. Nothing about the exterior suggests habitation. There are no signs of daily life. No visible storage areas, no practical courtyards, no defensive layering. Windows are large and expressive, unconcerned with vulnerability. Balconies and spires exist to be seen, not used. The building presents itself as a vision frozen in time, indifferent to function. The dramatic setting does more than support the structure. It completes it. Without the surrounding cliffs, forests, and open sky of the Bavarian Alps, the architecture would lose its spell. The castle relies on distance, elevation, and isolation to maintain its identity. Remove the landscape, and the illusion collapses. Every exterior line reinforces the same idea. This was never meant to feel real. It was meant to feel inevitable, as though it had always existed in stories and had simply chosen this mountain as the place to appear. The setting does not ground the castle in reality. It lifts it further away from it. Rooms inside the castle were conceived less as living spaces and more as symbolic environments. Every chamber carried a specific emotional weight, expressed through colour, scale, and imagery. Walls were covered in murals that transformed architecture into storytelling surfaces, turning daily movement through the interior into a continuous narrative experience rather than a practical routine. The throne hall stood as the clearest expression of symbolism over use. Modelled after Byzantine imperial churches, it emphasized divine kingship rather than governance. Gold mosaics, monumental columns, and a vast domed ceiling elevated the idea of authority into something sacred. The absence of an actual throne was deliberate. reinforcing the hall as a concept rather than a functioning seat of power. Private rooms followed the same logic of meaning over comfort. The bedroom was carved almost entirely from dark wood, filled with intricate Gothic ornamentation that referenced medieval monastic discipline more than royal leisure. Even the bed canopy and wall panels were sculpted with religious and heroic motifs, suggesting vigilance, purity, and sacrifice rather than rest. The Singers' Hall functioned as a tribute to legend and art rather than social life. Its size suggested a grand ceremonial space, yet it was rarely used. Murals depicting epic tales and mythical heroes lined the walls, while the layout echoed imagined medieval halls rather than historical ones. The room existed to honour story, music, and imagination, not gatherings. Symbolism extended into the smallest details. Swans appeared repeatedly in carvings, paintings, and textiles, referencing purity and idealized kingship. Celestial imagery, stars, suns, and halos reinforced themes of destiny and transcendence. Nothing was neutral. Every decorative choice carried intention, reinforcing an inner world made visible through architecture. Modern comforts were present but deliberately concealed. Heating systems, running water, and mechanical elements were hidden behind ornamentation, so they would not disrupt the illusion. Reality was allowed to function only if it remained unseen, supporting the symbolic environment without acknowledging itself. The throne room was conceived as a space of reverence rather than rule. Its vast proportions immediately separated it from the rest of the castle, rising higher and broader than any functional hall would require. The scale was not meant to host councils or ceremonies, but to overwhelm the individual standing within it, drawing the eye upward and away from earthly concerns. The architectural language deliberately echoed sacred structures instead of royal palaces. Modelled after Byzantine basilicas, the hall borrowed its visual authority from churches rather than courts. Tall columns divided the space rhythmically, while the elevated platform at one end suggested spiritual elevation more than political command. Power here was framed as something ordained, not exercised. Mosaics covered the walls and apse in shimmering gold and deep blue, depicting saints, angels, and symbolic figures associated with divine authority. These images did not celebrate conquest or governance. They emphasized moral legitimacy, purity, and destiny. Kingship was presented as a sacred condition, granted from above rather than enforced from below. With Ludwig gone, the castle lost its original purpose overnight. Rooms designed for contemplation stood unused. Halls meant for solitude were open to administrators and guards. Construction halted abruptly, leaving entire sections incomplete. Plans rolled up and forgotten. What had been a private world of imagination was suddenly exposed and vulnerable. The state moved quickly to redefine the building's role. Only weeks after the king's death, Neuschwanstein Castle was open to the public. Visitors were invited not to understand the inner logic of its creation, but to marvel at it. The castle shifted from personal refuge to national asset, its meaning reshaped by necessity rather than intent. Ironically, public access ensured survival. Entrance fees stabilized finances, preventing demolition or neglect. The unfinished became part of the story, frozen in time. Empty rooms, uninstalled features, and abrupt endings were preserved rather than corrected. What once represented escape from reality became a spectacle, anchored firmly within it. Visitors entered spaces that had never been meant to receive them. Corridors designed for quiet movement became passageways for for groups. Rooms built for contemplation were reduced to stops on a guided circuit. The building's logic shifted from inward to outward, prioritizing visibility over intention. Privacy vanished almost overnight. Many areas were still unfinished. Bare walls, exposed masonry, and incomplete decorative schemes stood beside lavishly completed rooms. Instead of being corrected, these interruptions were left as they were. The abrupt halt in construction became part of what visitors saw, a frozen moment where vision had been cut short. Incompletion itself became an exhibit. Administration redefined how the castle would function. Routes were planned to control flow, preserve fragile interiors, and maximize viewing efficiency. Objects were labeled, stories condensed, symbolism simplified. What had once been deeply personal imagery was translated into digestible explanation, often stripped of emotional context. Ironically, public access ensured survival. Admission fees stabilized finances and protected the structure from abandonment or demolition. What the state had taken from its creator, it preserved through exposure. The castle became economically valuable precisely because it no longer belonged to a single individual. The narrative surrounding Neuschwanstein Castle also changed. Instead of a retreat shaped by obsession and longing, it was presented as a fairy tale monument, detached from the instability and isolation that defined its origin. The king's intentions faded behind spectacle. Over time, the castle detached from its creator and attached itself to a nation. What began as a deeply personal refuge gradually became shorthand for an entire cultural identity. Neuschwanstein Castle was no longer read as the private dream of one man, but as a visual summary of Germany's imagined past, romantic, heroic, and timeless. Its image spread far beyond Bavaria. Reproduced on postcards, schoolbooks, travel posters, and later film and television, the castle became a visual anchor for old Germany in the global imagination. For audiences unfamiliar with the country's complex history, its towers and alpine setting offered a simplified, emotionally appealing symbol. Order, legend, and beauty untouched by modern conflict. This symbolic role was shaped by selective memory. The castle represented medieval chivalry and artistic idealism, not political fragmentation or industrial upheaval. It allowed Germany to project continuity with a mythic past, even as the nation itself changed, borders, governments, and identities. The structure absorbed meaning precisely because it stood outside practical history. During periods of national uncertainty, the castle's image grew stronger. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was increasingly framed as cultural heritage rather than royal eccentricity. After wars and regime changes, it remained visually stable, offering a sense of permanence when other symbols failed. Stone and landscape proved more reliable than ideology. International fascination amplified this transformation. Foreign visitors encountered Germany first through the castle's silhouette, not through cities or institutions. Its fairy tale quality softened perceptions, presenting the nation as romantic rather than aggressive, artistic rather than mechanical. The building functioned as cultural diplomacy without intent, shaping impressions through aesthetics alone. The irony lies in authorship. The symbol Germany embraced was never meant to represent the nation at all. It emerged from the inner world of Ludwig II of Bavaria, a ruler disconnected from politics and modern statehood. Yet his private vision proved adaptable enough to carry collective meaning long after his absence. Today, the castle stands less as architecture and more as an idea. It embodies a Germany that exists in imagination, rooted in legend, landscape, and longing rather than historical accuracy. In becoming a national symbol, it completed a transformation its creator never intended, turning personal escape into shared identity. The castle's silhouette proved unusually adaptable, capable of slipping from stone into illustration without losing its identity. Its clustered towers, narrow spires, and dramatic vertical emphasis translated easily into drawn form. When artists reduced it to outlines and curves, the structure became even more dreamlike, its proportions exaggerating emotion rather than scale. What mattered most was not accuracy, but recognizability. The steep roofs, tall windows, and irregular massing formed a visual shorthand for fairytale. These elements were simplified and refined, stripped of geological weight and historical context. The result was an architectural language that felt ancient and magical without belonging to any specific place or time. This transformation accelerated when Walt Disney encountered the castle during his travels in Europe. He was less interested in its history than in its emotional clarity. The building communicated wonder instantly. It did not require explanation. That immediacy made it ideal for visual storytelling aimed at universal audiences. In animated form, defensive features vanished entirely. Walls became thinner, towers taller, and windows larger. The castle no longer suggested isolation or obsession, only promise. What had once stood above a cliff in silence was reimagined as a welcoming centre, a place where stories began rather than where one man withdrew from the world. Theme park architecture pushed this reinterpretation further. Castles inspired by the original were engineered for visibility, symmetry, and approachability. Their scale was adjusted to feel grand without intimidation. Colours softened. Stone became pastel. The goal was emotional comfort, not awe born of distance or height. As these designs spread globally, the source became secondary to the symbol. Many recognized the fairytale castle without knowing its origin. The alpine setting, the troubled king, and the unfinished rooms disappeared from public consciousness. What remained was a distilled form, hopeful, elegant, and deliberately unreal. In this way, the castle's image completed a second transformation. It moved from private fantasy to national symbol, and then into global myth. Its outlines live on not as architecture, but as expectation, the promise that beyond the gates of imagination, a story is about to begin. The building began as a private escape, shaped by solitude rather than ceremony. Its rooms, corridors, and vistas were aligned to one person's inner landscape, not to an audience. Silence, distance, and elevation defined how it was meant to be experienced. Meaning flowed inward, not outward, and value was measured in emotional resonance rather than recognition. That inward logic collapsed the moment ownership shifted. With the removal of Ludwig II of Bavaria, the structure lost the single mind that held its intentions together. What remained was form without authorial control, an object open to reinterpretation. Administration replaced imagination, and preservation replaced creation. Public access altered perception at scale. Repetition changed meaning. As thousands, then millions, moved through the same rooms, the castle's private symbolism flattened into shared spectacle. Stories were standardized. Complexity was simplified. What had once required intimacy to understand now relied on distance to impress. Reproduction accelerated this shift. The silhouette circulated through print, photography, and later film, detaching the image from the place. Viewers encountered the castle without context, No mountain air, no unfinished corridors, no sense of isolation. The image became portable, repeatable, and increasingly abstract. Tourism completed the transformation. Infrastructure grew around the site to support flow rather than reflection. Timetables replaced wandering. Vantage points were fixed. The experience was curated for consistency, ensuring that the castle meant roughly the same thing to everyone, regardless of background or expectation. International adoption stripped away remaining specificity. In global imagination, the structure no longer represented a Bavarian retreat or a troubled ruler. It became a universal shorthand for fantasy itself, an architectural promise that did not belong to history, politics, or geography. What stands today as Neuschwanstein Castle is neither fully what it was nor entirely what it appears to be. It exists as a layered artifact, private dream turned public monument, local creation turned global icon. Each transformation removed something essential and added something durable, allowing the structure to outlive its original purpose by continually becoming something else.